Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bill Garrison. I'm the Dean of the USF Libraries, and I'd like to welcome all of you here. I'd want to introduce our speaker for today, but I'd like to give you a little bit of background. One of our librarians, Audrey Powers, was kind enough to make introductions, knew Rebecca, of Rebecca, and made introductions for Dr. Mark Greenberg and myself. And Mark and I had the pleasure of meeting Rebecca when we were in London during the fall, and we had an absolutely marvelous dinner and time with Rebecca, and we're absolutely thrilled that Rebecca is here. For those of you who don't know Rebecca, Rebecca is a noted British journalist and human rights advocate who's written extensively about human rights violations in Africa. She has served as a BBC reporter and covered major international stories for The Telegraph, Times, Independent, and New Statesman, among other publications. She also has a law degree from the London School of Economics. And there are many other things I could probably say about Rebecca that are too numerous to mention here, and I'd probably get wrong. Interviewing women, elders, and children throughout the Sudan, Ms. Tinsley has helped to raise awareness of the daily horrors suffered by some of that country's most vulnerable citizens. Her many efforts to advocate and to advance human and women's rights throughout Africa and to bring an end to genocide there include founding and directing the London-based non-governmental organization Waging Peace, initiating the Carter Center in the UK, serving on the London Committee of Human Rights Watch, and establishing the Rwanda Girls' School, a boarding school for poor and orphaned girls. We are honored to have Rebecca here and to be here during the launch of our USF Library's Holocaust and Genocide Study Center. Our exhibition of the Darfuri refugee children's drawings that Waging Peace is contributing to the center's collection and to the inaugural lecture series that we are starting in Genocide and Holocaust Study. I'm deeply honored and very privileged, and I want to ask you to join me in welcoming Rebecca Tinsley, please.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank Audrey Powers for discovering me. I'd also like to thank Mark and Bill so much, and I feel I really ought to issue a disclaimer at this point because I'm not an expert, I'm not an academic, I'm just a very privileged white woman who has got to wander around Africa asking questions, and it humbles me and shames me in a way that I'm here to try to be a voice for the people in Darfur that I have met, because I'm really not equal to that. However, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Darfur and also Rwanda and Bosnia, both genocides that I have been involved with over the years. We send a lot of students to Rwanda to do voluntary work, to teach English and computing and business studies. And if any of you are at all interested in what you hear today from me, I have left my business card at the back on the table, and please take the card and get in touch with me. It's also got our websites on it, and we would love to have you along for the ride, because I can honestly say it's the most interesting thing I have done so far in my negligible life. I've met people today here who have so much more expertise than I do, and I really feel a bit embarrassed about standing up here and assuming to talk to you, but a genocide is going on. If I give you the bold figures, it doesn't usually mean much to people, so let me just set it in a bit of context. When you open up your newspaper, there are columns down the outer margins that's called the sidebar. And those sidebars are made up of single paragraphs that have headings like Colombian mudslide, 500 die. Earthquake in the Philippines, 7,000 die. And then in the center of the paper, there's a story about Britney Spears. And that's the truth. That is what I think it's a kind of residual racism, actually. Those reflect our priorities, that we sidebar things. Here's an example. 2 years ago, in the summer of 2006, there was a short, nasty war in Lebanon. It went on for 34 days, and about 1,200 people died, and the entire world community gathered round to find a solution. At that point, those of us who cared about Darfur were conscious that it had been going on for 3 years, and 300,000 people had died, and 2.5 million people had been made homeless, and 90% of the black African villages in Darfur had been destroyed. But there was no rallying of the international community to do anything about it. That's what I mean by the sidebar. I am not saying that what happened in Lebanon wasn't awful. Of course it was. Another example, recently, many of you will have followed the siege in Mumbai of the 2 luxury hotels there. And as you know, it went on for 4 extraordinary days, and the entire world media were focused on that. At the same time that those admittedly awful events were happening, there's this country here called Nigeria. At exactly the same moment, the same number of people were killed in Nigeria by Nigerian Muslims killing Nigerian Christians. It got almost no publicity. It's a sign of what our priorities are. Or take most recently the Palestinian conflict. And again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't care about Palestine, Israel, or the people who have died and suffered. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that exactly the same moment that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was happening in Gaza, there was a little event going on here in Africa. There are a bunch of absolute maniacs in the north of Uganda called the Lord's Resistance Army. For 20 years, they have been running havoc. They have been kidnapping children, brutalizing them, making them become child soldiers. Often the process is to force them to kill their mom and dad and then chew the arm off their best friend so that they can never return to normal life. This has been going on for 20 years. Uganda decided to push the Lord's Resistance Army out of northern Uganda. So they went to southern Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo right here, and the Central African Republic. And they've been going from village to village, raping the women, stealing the food, and killing the men. And believe me, quite a lot more people have died very, very recently because of the Lord's Resistance Army and what's being done to flush them out, than died in Palestine. But I'm willing to bet you that very, very few of you have read anything about that. That is what I mean by the sidebar syndrome. At the same time, there is good news from Africa. There are millions of people who get up every day in Africa, and despite the odds of poverty and war, they lead decent lives, they care about their children, they struggle to save enough money to send their kids to school, they do not pick up a machete, they start businesses, and they work hard, and you never read about them. Because you know what? In the words of the editor of The Economist, who said to me, "You know what, Becky, we're not really interested in good news stories from Africa." No, they've decided what the story is with Africa. And so the fact that this country here, Benin, has managed to have several completely legitimate democratic handing overs of power is not of any interest to anyone. The fact that this country, Botswana, has also got a stable democracy and a very good welfare state, you're not going to read about it because that's not how we think of Africa. Do you know what editors want from me on Africa? They want quirky stories. You know what quirky means? Here's an example. While the Janjaweed militia were rampaging through Darfur, killing black Africans, there was a story from northern Sudan of a man who kept having sex with a goat, and so a magistrate made him marry the goat. That is the kind of story that they want, because it's quirky, because it shows these funny, strange people in a light that we're more comfortable with. It is part of our residual racism. And I have to say that I do know quite a few people in Darfur who were slightly fed up about that story getting so much publicity. I don't think the goat was very happy about it either. But it's symptomatic, I'm afraid. This is Sudan. In order for us to understand what is happening in Darfur, I'm sure that a lot of you are already completely expert about Darfur, so I'm going to try and keep this as brief as possible. There are several contributing factors, but you cannot understand what is happening now in Darfur without understanding what happened in South Sudan for the previous 20 years. The power in Sudan basically is with the Islamist Arabs who live along the Nile Valley in Khartoum. Right there, along the Nile Valley. Those Arab tribes have had the power basically since colonial times. You know, the British Empire always had this cool little thing where they divide and rule and pit people against each other in order to keep control. They also, incidentally, draw completely arbitrary borders where they stick tribes in together who normally really wouldn't want to be in the same country together, but that's all part of the game of control. The people there in Khartoum, with all the power, basically wanted to rid all of that area of southern Sudan of the black African tribes who had lived there, who were farmers who'd lived there for centuries and centuries. It could be, here's a contributory factor, there's oil there. Now, in 1976, the Chevron Corporation did a lot of exploration here in this area and discovered the oil. But there was this inconvenient fact that there were black African tribes living there and farming. So the Chevron Corporation decided to pay the local nomadic Arabs to ethnically cleanse and kill the black Africans. And guess what? It's a really cheap way of committing a genocide. And it was from that example, from the Chevron Corporation, that the people in Khartoum, up here, developed a system. They pay the nomadic, very, very poor African tribes to basically kill and ethnically cleanse the black Africans. They don't have to send their own soldiers there to die. It was incredibly effective. For 20 years, they committed genocide against the people of South Sudan who happened to be black African and Christian and animist. And approximately 2 million people died, but we don't know because it was in a sidebar and nobody could be bothered to count how many people died. This was so effective, this method, that they're now using it here in Darfur. The common factor is that it's black African tribes, again, who farm. But they're Muslim, so you have Muslim killing Muslim. But the people in Khartoum are Islamist, whereas the people here living in Darfur are they're not Islamist, but they are Muslim. The other common factor is that you have poor nomadic Arab people who are being forced south, incidentally, because the Sahara up here is moving south at a rate of 3.5 miles a year because of climate change. So they don't have any land on which they can graze their crops anymore. So they're looking for new land. And so Khartoum has stumbled on a really clever method of having genocide on the cheap. And as you know, so far, as I said, now about 400,000 people in Darfur have been killed. Massive ethnic cleansing. 250,000 of those people have moved over here to Chad, to the refugee camps where my organization is involved in Gosbeda and Farshana. Right there. I went there, right here to El Janina in the extreme west. I went there in 2004. I lied to get in because this is a note for any of you who are planning to have a genocidal dictatorship when you grow up. What you really want to do is keep the press out, because if you have a vacuum, you can get away with anything. And the Sudanese regime, they may be appalling people, but they are also very clever. And they have therefore sealed this whole vast area, the size of France or Texas, off. And there are virtually no journalists and there are hardly any human rights reporters in Darfur. Therefore, it was extremely difficult for me to get in, and that's a long story how I did it, but it involved lying. I interviewed people in this camp in El Janina who had walked for days and days and days across here to get to safety. And the bizarre thing was, it wasn't safety. When they arrived there are no fences around the camps, there's no one to protect them. So every time the women have to go out for firewood, which is a daily necessity, they get attacked by the same people who ethnically cleansed their village, these nomads who are called the Janjaweed. The Janjaweed are 3 miles, that's their camp, 3 miles from the camp in El Janina that I visited. There's no one to protect these people. I remember one particular young woman called Hawa who had walked for 8 days to get to the camp. She'd been raped so many times she could hardly sit down. Her entire family had been murdered by the Sudanese army. The Air Force, the pattern typically is the Air Force comes in and it bombs the village. They're followed by the Janjaweed on camel and horseback, who kill the men and the boys, rape the women, throw the children on fires, loot the animals and burn the houses, and then they put the dead bodies in the wells to poison the water. And Hawa had been raped several times and of course was HIV positive. What I remember Hawa telling me, I interviewed many, many women while I was there. And incidentally, it wasn't just young women who were being raped. I remember talking to a woman who was very old indeed. She didn't know how old she was, but I would say 60, which is very old in their terms. And she told me that the Janjaweed had come prepared to rape older women with razor blades to slit open their atrophied vaginas. So they were all set for what they wanted to do. I remember Hawa saying to me that while she was being raped, the people raping her yelled racial insults at her. They called her a slave. And unfortunately, one of the aspects of this genocide is a racist assumption that black Africans are inferior, and that the Quran, there are two surah in the Quran that they always point to that justify the use of black Africans as slaves, and that happens across North Africa, incidentally. But there was a pattern that Hawa mentioned about her rape that I found with other people as well, and that was, they said, the first genocide is when we kill your men. The second genocide is when we rape the women, because in a traditional society, that's how you destroy the whole fabric of a society. And the third genocide is when you get AIDS. And of course, they wanted to dilute their blood. That was the other aspect. Now, I found this particularly, I mean, of course, it's creepy anyway. I found it haunting because the women I'd interviewed in Rwanda and Bosnia said exactly the same thing to me, that the same racial insults were told to them, the same racial justification, the same hatred, and then the same line about the second genocide being, and the third genocide being AIDS. And that's when I finally realized, I'm a little slow catching on to these things, I finally realized rape truly is a weapon of war. It's how you destroy societies. Incidentally, the president of Sudan says rape doesn't exist. He literally said rape does not exist in Islam. What he means is that a woman in Darfur says she's been raped. She's either lying because she's related to the rebels, or she wanted it. And if she gets pregnant, that means she enjoyed it. He also says slavery doesn't exist, but we're going to get to that later. Incidentally, Hawa, when I asked her what she wanted us to do, she said, you know, it's really kind of you to send the food, but this is Africa and we're pretty good at coping. That's the one thing we really know how to do, is to manage. She said, what we'd like you to do is take the guns away from the people who are killing us. And of course, the truth is that we're more likely to give Hawa a Mercedes-Benz than we are to take the guns away from the people who are killing us. And to my horror, Hawa said to me, well, you've got to be our voice. And I said, I'm a privileged white woman with a ticket to get out of here. I'm the luckiest person on earth. How can I possibly be your voice? And she looked around and she said, do you see anyone else who's going to do this? So in my very imperfect way, I have been trying to tell people what Hawa and her friends have been going through ever since. That is what one of the villages looks like after the Sudanese Air Force has done a softening up raid. And while you look at that, I would like to just talk about why this happens and the pattern, because as I mentioned, I was involved in what happened in Bosnia and Rwanda as well. And what I want most of all, that everyone in this room, when you leave today, please do not think that genocide is something that happens in Africa. Genocide is part of the human condition. This is something we are all capable of given the right circumstances. Just remember that during the Holocaust, really quite ordinary Germans would kill Jews all day, and then they would go home and they would listen to Beethoven and they would read Goethe. They were not stupid people or particularly poor people. What you need is a certain number of factors to make genocide possible. And what I want you to bear in mind is that people who think they are incredibly civilized can turn to genocide. A story that I think all of us should remember. Whenever I'm talking about this in Britain, people stand up and say, the British, we could never have done that. And I have to remind them that there was a concentration camp on British soil during World War II. It was in the Channel Islands. And within 4 hours of the Nazis arriving in the Channel Islands, the British had voluntarily handed over all the Jews to a concentration camp. No fight. And within 4 hours, the Nazis were sitting down and playing bridge with the poshest families in the Channel Islands, because guess what? social class matters more than these other little difficulties, and all their families had been on holiday in Baden-Baden together during the 30s. There are certain things that help create the conditions for a genocide. One of them is colonial borders that are arbitrarily drawn, that lump all kinds of people in together, and as I mentioned before, the British were past masters at this because, I mean, a typical example actually is what the Belgians did in Rwanda, where you have a Tutsi minority of 15% and you have a Hutu majority of 85%, and the Belgians decided to put the Tutsi in charge, and then just as they left in 1960, they decided to reverse it and put the Hutu in charge. And anyone who tells you the Rwandan genocide was a big surprise when it happened in '94, no, it wasn't. They'd been happening in smaller numbers since 1959. All the signs were there. And as with most of these genocides, if we bothered to look for the signs, believe me, we would absolutely see them. Another condition is relative economic decline, but I think sometimes too much is made of that. One thing I have found in my own admittedly uneducated way is that if I had $1 for every Rwandan who said to me, you know, we had an education system that didn't encourage people to ask questions, far too deferential, no questioning of authority. So when the orders came down to kill, people did. And that applies equally to the former Yugoslavia and, of course, to Weimar Germany. Again, this is not an African syndrome, it's a human syndrome. Hate propaganda, but it's not enough to racially hate someone. It's not enough to despise their religion. The key factor, I think, is fear. Once you have convinced someone that unless they kill that Tutsi or that Jew or that Armenian, unless you kill them, they're going to come and get you. Once you've done that and you've dehumanized them, I promise you it's really easy to kill your neighbor because, gee, I'm just defending myself. And that's the brilliance of really good hate propaganda, is that it adds the fear to that, so you feel justified in what you're going to do. And now for the bit that I always enjoy talking about, because I hope it gets the academics in the room squirming. In a lot of these genocides, there has been an intellectual pretext for the genocide. There has been some clever son of a bitch who writes a book saying, it is the destiny of the Arab people to flush the black Africans out of this part of Africa. Lebensraum, it is the destiny of the German people to get the Jews out. It is the destiny of the people of Serbia to have greater Serbia. It is to our shame that there is always someone educated who should know better, who will provide a text that calls on the young men in particular to seize this great moment of destiny and to do what has to be done. And it happens again and again. Equally depressing is our response, the pattern of the way we respond. The first thing we do is that we deny that it's genocidal in intent. We do this by saying, oh, you know, ancient ethnic hatreds, you know, all kinds of tribal things that we don't understand. That's one way that we get around it. Another way is that we deny the scale. So, for instance, recently some British cabinet minutes from the Second World War were published, and they revealed Churchill's reaction when a Jewish delegation came to see him to tell him what was happening in the death camps. And the memo says, well, you know, the Jewish people, they're rather excitable and they're given to overreaction. So we're going to treat this with a pinch of salt. Exactly the same thing has happened with every genocide that I've looked at, is that we deny that there is a genocidal intent and then we deny the scale of it. Another favorite trick is to pretend that it's a humanitarian disaster rather than having political roots. We did this in Bosnia, God knows. I remember a Bosnian saying to me, well, nice of you to give us the food, you know, you're keeping us alive until the Serbs can kill us. That's so often the response. And we do that, incidentally, because it's so much easier to write a check than to actually try and have a political process to solve the underlying problems in this. This is happening in Darfur, and it has right from the beginning. And so I still meet people who say to me, oh, Darfur, isn't there some awful famine there? So much easier, wouldn't it be? rather than actually confronting the fact that we need a political solution to this. Another game is moral equivalency, and this one we drag out all the time. They're all as bad as each other. Oh, I can't be bothered with that. Oh, Africa, what a mess, bottomless pit. And it lets us off the hook, because the minute we can say that, they're all as bad as each other, we don't have to do anything about it. Another one is to engage ourselves in endless peace processes. This happened constantly during Yugoslavia, the breakup of Yugoslavia. Slobodan Milosevic, ghastly man, really clever guy. He constantly involved the Western powers in peace processes. I remember one particularly splendid moment when a really pompous British politician called Lord Carrington was signing a peace deal with the Serbs. And as he signed it, the Serbs were shelling the room in which he was signing it, so he had to hide under the table as he signed the peace deal. Still, he didn't get it, that trying to do business with the architect of the genocide is not a great idea. And so when I have people say to me, well, you know, the Darfuris, they really, you know, why don't they try and make peace instead of being like that? It's a bit like saying to the Jews, you need to have a ceasefire with Hitler. Same looniness. Now, sadly, another common reaction is among some of the leadership in Africa, and I say leadership rather than Africans, because there's a huge difference. Too many of the leaders in Africa have turned a blind eye to the genocide going on in these countries. Bit of audience participation now. Can any of you name the one leader who spoke out, one African leader who spoke out during the Rwandan genocide? Any guesses? Nelson Mandela. That was easy, wasn't it? And during the entire problem with Idi Amin, God knows how many people killed, only Julius Nyerere in Tanzania bothered to speak out against what was happening. Now, the reason for this, one reason is that if you're having a corrupt dictatorship in your own country, the last thing you want is to shine the light of criticism on someone else, because it might be turned on you one day. There is another more sinister reason, I'm afraid, that quite a lot of African leaders, and I do make this differentiation because if you listen to any radio station in Africa, to phone-ins, you will hear a lot of really angry people who are furious that the citizens of Darfur are being slaughtered in these numbers. But their leaders are not taking, most of them are not taking action. Unfortunately, there is a lot of Gulf Arab money pouring in to African states, buying off leaders. And this comes very useful when you have a vote on the UN on something like, say, Israel. In a lot of African cities, you'll find a King Faisal hospital. You'll also find several Mercedes in the garage of the minister of this, that, or the other, and it is simply a question of buying off these people's support. Oh, the other problem, of course, is the reaction of the Arab world. Basically, the people in Darfur are the wrong kind of Muslims, just as the people in Bosnia. Darn it, they were the wrong kind of Muslims, so they don't get any help. It's shaming that Muslim can be killing Muslim at the moment. I remember the Sudanese foreign minister saying to me, I don't know why you're here making all this trouble about these Darfuri children. Don't you know that more children are being killed every day in Palestine? And that's the discourse that we have. Why does the West appease? This is the question. One of the reasons is the war on terror, I'm afraid. Look at the people on the United Nations Security Council. The Russians, the Chinese, the French, the British, and the Americans. The French are in there with oil interests. The Russians are selling them arms. The Chinese are selling them arms and also have a huge interest in Sudan's oil. So you're not going to get any joy from them. This leaves us Britain and America. Britain and America have had so much to say about how disgraceful it is that this genocide is going on in Darfur. But sadly, the CIA is like that with the Sudanese secret services, and it's about the war on terror. And this is part of a pattern. We've done it since colonial times, that we divide up Africa according to our needs, whether it be that we're raping their minerals or keeping them in our camp. After colonial times, we had the Cold War, and so we used to prop up the most unspeakable dictators because they were on our side in the Cold War, and now it's the war on terror, and we give a free pass to really some very unsavory people simply because they supposedly agree with us. I'm afraid also one of the reasons we're not doing anything is that we are appeasing Arab opinion. And there's no nice way of putting this, and I apologize to you if I offend you, but the Iraq War was not a really great idea for the people of Darfur. It really wasn't, because America and Britain are not able to have a great deal of moral authority in talking on these subjects when what's been going on has been going on in Iraq. And I've actually had people say to me, you know, you shouldn't be there stirring up this trouble about Darfur. You should give the Arabs a break. As if somehow, because of the sins of what has been happening in Iraq, we therefore allow Arabs to kill black Africans in Darfur. I don't understand that. The other sad aspect, of course, is there are not enough demands from African leaders for universal human rights. Time for me to give you another picture, and actually I'll now try and shut up a bit and let you see these pictures. These photos were taken by an American Marine called Brian Steidel, who was serving with the African Union Monitoring Force. And they give you an idea what these villages, 90% of these villages have now been destroyed. And frankly, if that ain't genocide, I really don't know what is. A remarkably brave, one of the great things about my life is I get to meet the most astonishingly brave Africans who are coping in hideous circumstances. This photograph was taken on the mobile cell phone of an African doctor working in Darfur. The Sudanese army had gone into a refugee camp. Remember how I said they weren't very safe? Well, they're not. He'd gone into this refugee camp, and the Sudanese had, and they'd killed 55 young men, and they'd tortured quite a few others. And I just want you to look at the fear on that young person's face. It gives you an idea of what that person had endured. I'm now going to show you some photographs of the results of torture, and I'm warning you that they're very disturbing images, because not that I care that you get upset, because I actually want you to get upset, because you should get upset. I warn you because I know Americans use any excuse to sue people, and so you're not suing me over this. I've warned you. And incidentally, I'm choosing images that are the least horrible that I have. These are the least awful images. That is a standard method of torture, is to scrape away the skin on a chap's or a lady's foot. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd kind of hoped that if this was done to me, I would pass out, that my maker would take pity on me, and that I would pass out. And the hideous news, guys, is that you stay absolutely conscious for the whole of this torture. This is a slightly happier story. This is a young man called Rashid, and he was thrown onto a fire by the Sudanese army when he was 8 years old. And as you can see in that picture on the right, his arm was badly damaged. Now, this kind of makes me want to vomit, but you know how they say that nobody cares about big numbers, but if you individualize it and you find one cute kid, then you can get people to empathize. We decided to try and make an example of Rashid. So we got a very right-wing newspaper in Britain that normally wouldn't publish a story about Africa. We got them to run this story about Rashid, about what had happened to him, about why we needed money to send him to South Africa to have his arm rebuilt. And guess what? An outpouring of money. And I still feel sick about this, because it was one little boy among hundreds of thousands who need psychotherapy and who need a lot of help. However, we achieved the aim, we hope, of helping him. Well, we know we helped him, but also of trying to focus attention. But believe me, I don't feel comfortable about this. That's another one of the less revolting pictures that I have of a standard method of torture in the place I'm talking about. Our field worker, Anna Schmidt, was in Chad, in the refugee camps in Gosbeda and Farshana. She wanted to interview the women about their experiences and how they had survived the genocide, but she found it difficult because their kids kept bothering her. So without even thinking, Anna handed round crayons and paper and just said to the kids, draw a picture, draw a picture. And they said, what of? And she said, of your life. And she didn't think anything more of it. This is what was produced. We have 500 incredibly graphic images of the genocide. Now, why this matters is because, as I mentioned before, the Sudanese regime are very clever and they keep the journalists out. And so there are virtually no images of the ongoing genocide in Darfur. And that is why the International Criminal Court in The Hague contacted us about these drawings and said, we want these, because these are actually evidence of the context of genocide and war crimes. And so the cool thing is that we've been able to go back to the kids that drew these pictures, and we have been able to say to them, you are not a victim, you are actually holding to account. And one day you will end the impunity of the people who killed your dad and your brother and your grandfather. And it is very empowering for them, believe me. Spontaneously, kids around the world who have seen these pictures, because they've been in newspapers and on tour, kids around the world have been sending us solidarity pictures. And we have been taking them to the camps in Chad, and that blows away the Darfuris because they think they're all alone. They don't think anyone cares or knows. And for someone in a school in Santa Barbara or Chile or Mexico or Lithuania to say, I'm thinking of you and I care, I know it sounds corny, but it matters a great deal, believe me. But it's not enough. It's not enough. And therefore, my organization, Waging Peace and Network for Africa, which is our humanitarian wing, we are raising money to send psychotherapists to these camps because these kids are way screwed up. They are getting, we keep these people alive, but that's it. With food, that's it. And these kids haven't had so much as an aspirin to help them get through this. So we're sending psychotherapists. We would not presume to know how to do one-on-one psychotherapy in a society that is so different. So what we do is that we're using something that we've done in Rwanda for the past 3 years. We gather together willing community leaders, the kind of wise auntie figures that you get in quite a lot of African societies, the people that you trusted to go to with your troubles. We are skilling them in the basic techniques of psychotherapy. Because you know what, it's going to be centuries before there are enough skilled, trained psychotherapists to offer the help that is necessary. We are therefore skilling already recognized community leaders, virtually all of them women, in how to give love, support, and comfort. Simple things like how to breathe, how to relax, how to begin to talk, and then most important, how to break the cycle of trauma. Because these people are living in a kind of hell. And so if any of you happen to know anybody rich who wants to do something useful, it costs us an awful lot of money to send these psychotherapists there. Please let me know. One of the aspects of these drawings incidentally, I should say that I'm part of a Zionist conspiracy to hoodwink all of you, apparently. The Sudanese government says that. You wouldn't think I was Jewish, but I've had a lot of operations. And this is a Zionist plot, because the Sudanese government says none of this is happening. What I find really interesting on this drawing is here we have a tank flying the Sudanese flag. That's not happening. The Sudanese army says they have never taken tanks into any of these villages. So these kids, obviously, they were just lying. Here's another interesting aspect. Look at the skin color of the person doing the killing, and then look at the skin color of the victim. Now, you will meet all kinds of clever asses who will say to you, as they do to me, it's too simplistic to say that it's Arab against Black African. And yeah, it is, because there's a huge amount of intermarriage. But guess what? If you ask a child in Darfur, who are you? They self-identify as Black African. And you know what? That's what matters. One of the few things I have learned as I have stumbled through Bosnia and Rwanda and Darfur is what matters is how you self-identify. And so, in the eyes of these children, the people who are killing them have virtually white skin. Now, if many of the people here in this room who are not African if you'd met someone who was supposedly Arab and supposedly Black African, I promise you, you would think that they are of the same background. What matters is how we self-identify. Always bear that in mind, please. In the bottom right-hand corner of that image, you will see women being led off to slavery. Now, many of you will have hoped that that happened a long time ago and wasn't going to happen again. But while we were concerned about other things, slavery has continued in Africa all this time. In Mauritania, it was only outlawed last year. 1 in 3 Mauritanians was technically a slave, and that means that when they gave birth, their children were confiscated and given away as presents to other people. It seems astonishing to me that we live in a world where this is going on. These women in Darfur are taken and they are put on planes and they are taken to Khartoum, the Sudanese capital, and they are distributed amongst officers of the Sudanese army as gifts and as presents, and they use them as they wish. And you can imagine what that entails. Another picture that really doesn't need me to tell you what is going on. Again, obviously there are no helicopters bombing Darfur because the Sudanese Army and Air Force say that's not happening. Here's one of the little guys, our artists, who drew the picture. A happier scene from Farshana camp in Chad. But here's the problem. As a guy said to me, I'm a farmer and I'm used to living 100 yards away from my neighbor, and now I'm living 1 yard away from him. These folks don't want to be in these camps. This is not a fun place to live. There is a social breakdown, the consequences of which we do not understand, because young men in particular feel frustrated because they're being crammed into these places. They feel powerless because, first of all, they're not able to earn any money. Secondly, they're not able to defend their people. And they are beginning to challenge the authority, the traditional authority. And there are all kinds of problems happening that we really aren't bearing in mind, I'm afraid. So, what is the solution? I don't actually think it's that complicated, because on many occasions the United Nations Security Council has voted for resolutions on what to do about Darfur, and we haven't enforced any of them. It is absolutely amazing. The resolutions are there on the book. Things like targeted economic sanctions against the architects of this genocide. Things like a no-fly zone to stop the Sudanese Air Force bombing its own civilians. Things like an asset freeze, again, targeted at the architects of this genocide, to make it personal. When I came back from Darfur, we arrived first thing in the morning, and I should first tell you, there is a famous British horror story about a man who has a dream that he's standing up and speaking in the House of Lords, and then he wakes up and he finds he is standing up and speaking in the House of Lords. Well, I got off this plane from Khartoum, having really not slept for the past 4 days, because I don't know about you, but I'm not very good at sleeping in a war zone where there are horrible things happening around me. And I was pretty spaced out anyway, and I was taken directly to the House of Lords and Commons, where my friend, a British politician, and I addressed a joint meeting of Lords and Commons, and if that isn't surreal, I don't know what is. But sitting in the front row was the Sudanese ambassador. And I did my little spiel about Hawa and the people I'd met and what I'd seen and what I thought needed to be done. And I talked about the rape, and he didn't seem at all concerned about this, that all these women and girls and old ladies were being raped and brutalized with sticks. I talked about the children being thrown on fires. Again, he didn't really seem too bothered about that. He glanced at his watch a few times because, you know, I go on a bit. I got to the bit where I said, and you know what, we should personalize this. We should actually stop these people going on their shopping trips to Paris. And he went berserk. And I thought, right, I got you, you bastard. You make it personal, targeted. You stop these people traveling around and enjoying this very good life that they have while their people suffer and die. I really, really believe that what it needs is concerted international action on Darfur. You guys have the perfect moment, because you have just elected a man who believes, I hope, that it is time for America to learn to play nicely with other children. And I hope that he will provide the impetus to work together with other countries. The fascinating thing about Darfur is, on all the occasions that the international community has actually decided to speak with one voice on Darfur, the Sudanese have given in immediately. They get away with murder because we allow them to. It's just like Bosnia. This is what drives me out of my mind, having lived through and tried to help through the whole Bosnian thing, was that if only the international community had spoken with one voice in a clear and serious and concerted manner, we would let these genocidaires know that we are serious. As it is, they know that we don't have the political will. And that is the tragedy of this situation. It matters, in case you don't think it matters because every time totalitarianism rears its head, we have to deal with it. And if we don't, it will one day come and get us. All of you know from when you were young and you had bullies in your school that the bully will get away with everything unless you and your friends get together and put the bully back in his box. That's what we have to do in this case. And we have to fight totalitarianism every time it pops up, because one day it will pop up in a neighborhood near you, and then you will care. It is my shame that in the years since I met Hawa and those other women in Darfur, that every single night since then I have gone to bed with a full stomach, and I have gone to bed in a nice safe house with a husband who takes care of me. I don't know what happened to Hawa or any of those women. I don't even know if they're still alive. And that seems in the year 2009 simply unacceptable. Please now help. Thank you.
I would like to thank Rebecca. Rebecca will field some questions. We'll be happy to do so. As we're taping this, please use the microphone that is being held by Elizabeth back in the back. And we will be posting this on our website for the Holocaust and Genocide Study Center, and the website will officially launch during the month of February. Also on your seats, there's a little card. If you wish to fill in your email address and contact information, we'll be happy to email you about upcoming events. And I would like to turn the floor over now for questions for Rebecca. Questions?
Hi. You mentioned that before every genocide there are signs that we don't bother with. In this particular Darfur genocide, what were the signs that we ignored? And I know probably hate propaganda is one of them, because you talked about that. But could you say more about how that propaganda was disseminated and what the other signs may have been?
Well, the biggest sign was that for 20 years the people in Khartoum had been killing the black Africans in South Sudan. I think that's probably an indication that they want to get rid of black Africans from all of Sudan, and they managed to kill 20 million of them to get at the oil. We should have realized the nature of the totalitarian Islamist dictatorship that there is in Khartoum. Also, I've spoken to sheikhs in Darfur about this specific question. And they said, no, it didn't begin in 2003. They were actually bombing them and ethnically cleansing on a small scale from the mid-'80s. There was a terrible famine. There were many signs. The most obvious example of signs, incidentally, there wasn't that much hate propaganda involved in Darfur because the Janjaweed are so desperately poor, and also had this idea. Incidentally, they're highly disposable. Once the Sudanese regime has finished with the Janjaweed, they will dump them and they will go back to poverty. But there was also the Islamist ideology that played a part in politicizing the Janjaweed. But mostly they're doing this for money, because they're incredibly poor people. Rwanda is the obvious example of a place where all the signs were there, where the first of the genocide started in 1959. And we really just chose not to know about that because, as somebody in Rwanda said to me, we have carrots rather than oil. But all the signs were there, the hate propaganda, smaller genocides, 20,000 people at a time, huge movements of population, Tutsi leaving Rwanda to go to the neighboring countries for safety. We always choose not to see this. And an example of our attitude to this, to genocide prevention, I had the honor of meeting an extraordinary man called Juan Mendez, who was imprisoned by the Argentine junta for his human rights work. And he was appointed as the United Nations Rapporteur on Genocide Prevention. The United Nations provided him with precisely half a secretary and no money and no office. So that gives you an idea how much they care about it. The money ran out, and Juan Mendez is no longer doing that job. What do you think? Do you have a comment? Do you have a comment or a comeback?
Yeah, well, you said that we weren't bothering with signs, and I was just wondering what's the obvious? What was the obvious? I think you well answered it. Yeah.
What would you suggest that we can do locally, to help with what's going on in Darfur?
Thank you for that question. You've got a newly elected Congress. Now is the time to write. I know it's an old-fashioned idea. Write, email, phone. Put pressure on them, tell them that we have to enforce the UN resolutions. It's as simple as that. Write to President Obama. I want to remind you of something that happened during the Rwandan genocide. The late, great Senator Paul Simon, who was very unhappy about the Rwandan genocide, he used to go to the State Department and say, this terrible thing is happening, we have to act. And the State Department would say to him, oh yeah, and how many people from your district have phoned you? And he'd say, oh, well, nobody. And he said, if only I'd been able to walk in there and say that 50 or 60 people, that's all it takes, incidentally. That's regarded as a landslide of opinion. If only 50 or 60 people had phoned me, I could have gone to the State Department and said, you have to act on this because American people care. And now is the moment to do that. Any consciousness raising that you can do, however, letters to the paper, it's never a wasted effort. One of these things, I mentioned this gentleman, Juan Mendez, who I respect so much. He said to me, you're in for a long battle on this one because there's always another subject that comes in. I know there's some Save Darfur people here, so they'll know what I mean. There's always some other subject that comes along that people are more interested in, and because it's Africa, let's be honest, no one cares as much. He said to me, you have to be like a grain of sand in the eyes of the decision makers. Just keep annoying them. Keep Darfur on the agenda. And that's what we got to do. The Save Darfur lady.
I'm Sarah McGee. I'm a PhD in communication studies here and also an active member of STAN, which is our student anti-genocide awareness chapter here on campus. A couple of members are here. And every time that we're able to have speakers, I always ask, what can you say or what can we do to really rally college students here? Because there's always competition for something. I know Mariana Pappas and I wrote an op-ed piece for the Oracle that unfortunately wasn't printed about your coming and the exhibition and the things like why students on this campus specifically should care, because there was so much support for Obama, and Obama has actually spoken out about this. So what advice can you give us? That would follow up, I guess, with what you've already said about.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to get people involved in. I know it's tedious and it's boring, but it is letter writing, it is email writing, it is phone calls, and awareness raising as well. Because, as you say, there is a huge competition out there for all these other subjects, and we just have to stick at it. We went through this in Bosnia as well, incidentally, and I know that is no comfort to you whatsoever, but we owe it to the people there. That's what always stuns me about Darfurians, incidentally. I don't know how they get up every day. I don't know how they carry on. It's like the people I know in Rwanda. I have no idea how they keep positive. And if they can do it, then we have to do it too. Yeah. But thank you so much for what you're doing, and anybody who's here should be involved with STAND.
I have a real quick question, and that is, has any attempt been made to hold the people like Chevron and some of the people who've supported this government or have been perpetrators? Have there been any attempts to have economic consequences against some of those companies and corporations?
You got to be kidding.
I wouldn't boycott Chevron. I mean, I would boycott any company I knew if I knew enough. I would not give that company my business. Has any attempt been made to do that? You're talking about personal consequences here.
My dear, Africa is open for business, as it always has been, and we're there to rape the continent and to take things out of it. The Democratic Republic of Congo, this is a perfect example. There are loads of Western companies involved there, and they are fueling a war that has claimed 5 million lives in the last 10 years. This is the Third World War, but because it's in Africa, nobody cares about it. Unfortunately, we are still taking the attitude to Africa that we did 100 years ago and 100 years before that. They have resources that we want, and now they've discovered massive amounts of oil in West Africa, which is why, incidentally, your government props up a despicable regime in Equatorial Guinea. Again, you ain't read about that, have you? Unfortunately, there are no consequences for these people. It would be very nice to have a boycott of Chevron, but from my own point of view, we have such limited resources in this struggle of ours that we have to go for the lever, which is elected representatives. But it breaks my heart to say this, but you know, any of you that own a cell phone, you're all complicit in what's happening in Congo because there's a mineral called coltan in that phone, and that's where it comes from. 7 neighboring countries at one point were involved in the rape of Congo, but we, the West, are the ones who are there to stay.
Hi. Can you describe conceptually the library services and resources that would better enable you or those like you to do your job?
I would like Bill to answer that.
One of the things that we have hoped to accomplish certainly is to acquire the resources that will actually illustrate what is actually happening, look at not just the intellectual effort but the reality, and to put a context around what is really going on. So it's not just gathering the primary source material, books, archival records if we can find them, but also to really gain and perhaps gather some artifacts as well. Clearly, one of the issues we have to address is if people don't know what's going on, you can't do anything about it and you don't know anything about it. And so we feel very strongly that it is one of our primary roles to gather the information and to make it available for scholars, for the community, for the campus, to make sure that we are involved in that educational process so that we can all begin and hopefully prevent genocides from happening in the future. I would like to ask Rebecca a question as well. During one of the conversations that we had, Rebecca's organization, Waging Peace, not only has these pictures of the children, as Rebecca has described them, they're refrigerator drawings, and they're refrigerator drawings until you really look at them. And then it's like, oh my Lord, what happened? One of the other pieces of sets of documents that Waging Peace has is petitions that were written by the Darfuris, and I would like Rebecca to talk to you all a little bit about that and to let you know what those are.
Thank you. But first of all, I want to stress how important it is what's happening right here at USF by creating this archive, because we. It's a cliche, but you know, we never learn enough about history, and if we're going to prevent this stuff happening again, we all have to know about genocide and about why it happens. And I tried rather inadequately to talk about the patterns, and all of us are not going to understand those patterns that have come right through from, you know, the first genocide that in the modern time that we know about, which was in Namibia, the Harara people, through Armenia, Cambodia, the Holocaust. We need to know the information. We need to see the pattern. We need to understand where we come from. It is part of our discovery of what we are as human beings, both the evil and the good in us. And as I mentioned before, genocide is not something that happens in Africa. It's part of the human condition. And it's incredibly important what you're doing here, because there are lots of folks in Africa who want to know about this as well. And thanks to the internet, they will actually be able to do research and to find out, because there are still, unfortunately, a few governments who don't want people to have access to the truth and to understand history. And it's incredibly important that you think about the folks who can't make it to a wonderful library like you have. And we owe it to them to publish and to make this available. And I'm so pleased to be able to be involved with what you're doing here, Bill and Mark. Incidentally, it is also a real thrill for the people in Darfur to know that their drawings matter this much. The International Criminal Court, yeah, that's pretty good. But this is also quite cool if you're a kid in a camp in Darfur. When we were working in Darfur, it's a continual process, but on one occasion, one of the tribal elders, a sheikh, he said to us, so what do you do in your country when you're trying to get your government to change its mind? And we said, well, we go around with scraps of paper and we compile petitions. We get people to sign a piece of paper asking for a certain demand. And you could see this light bulb go on over this Darfuri sheikh's head. And they have quite a lot of time on their hands in this camp. Oh, the men do. The women are busy doing absolutely everything. The guys really got their minds around this, and we now have this incredible pile of paper. It was 60,000 when we met you. It's now 100,000 signatures on bits of paper. But we obviously did a bad job of explaining the concept, because we actually have 100,000 essays from people about what's happened to them. And we have messages, you know, addressed to Gordon Brown and to George Bush about precisely what has happened to my family and what I would like you to do. Most of the people who participated are illiterate, and so you've got thumbprints, and you have the same handwriting throughout. Some dear person who went round with this piece of paper taking down this petition. And we have presented it to George Bush, and we've presented it to Ban Ki-moon at the UN and to Gordon Brown as well. And we're going to keep on holding it round with us and presenting it to people until it comes to live here. My job was to talk to the women in this particular camp in El Janina in Darfur, and I was traveling with a male colleague, and he interviewed the men. And it was only at the end that we got together with some of the sheikhs. I was really taking testimony, but some of the attitudes were hilarious. I remember one woman, when I kept saying, what do you want us to do? What do you want us to do? And I remember her saying, actually, I want you to send white soldiers here. And I said to the translator, are you sure she said that? And the woman said, yeah, because you're white boys. You'll find it so unpleasant here and so hot, because I know you want to go back to your land of ice, that you'll get the job done quickly and you go home. And I thought, that's really good logic, actually. More seriously, there were some people who wanted an independent Darfur, but the majority of people were not asking for anything particularly radical. They would like self-determination for Darfur. They have somewhat fallen out of love with the rest of Sudan since the government in Khartoum is practicing ethnic cleansing and genocide on them. But they very much want self-determination, democracy, development, schools. I mean, they'd been marginalized for decades. They want hospitals, schools. They're not asking for the moon. They want some kind of self-government, a canton system even. These are not radicals, you know, they're not highly politicized people. They want peace. They want their kids to grow up in security and to have the opportunities that all of us have. It's really actually very simple.
Hi, I'm majoring in anthropology, and I would like my future to focus on war and how it affects people. And you said, sorry, I came in late, but you said that you're reaching out to the community leaders and teaching them psychotherapy. And I thought that was really interesting. But my question is there any money going out to them, like reestablishing their native rituals of cleansing and transformation and reintegration, since, you know, if you use Western psychotherapy, it might not be as effective as using their own native meanings and
right, we're not actually using Western psychotherapy. Okay. We're teaching them the techniques of relaxing and breathing and breaking the cycle of trauma, and we're very, very careful. We've done this in Rwanda for some years, and we've now begun doing it in northern Uganda as well, and we really do understand that we have to make it culturally sensitive, otherwise it's completely meaningless. A lot of the cultural, the consequence of this, and it actually ties into the last question that I failed to answer properly, I'm sorry about that, is that a lot of the social aspects, they're breaking down. It isn't just that the boys are rejecting the authority of the leaders anymore. When you take a lot of rural people and put them in a camp it really changes their society radically. And I'm not sure how you put the genie back in the bottle. And I actually feel almost violent with anger when white people, especially evangelical Christians, tell me that we should be working on peace and reconciliation, because I would quite like to deal with some of the more fundamental problems first. And I actually don't feel we are in any position to be lecturing these folks on peace and reconciliation. I've learned that in Rwanda. There are really more fundamental and basic issues, like, for instance, in Chad, the population living around the camps feel that the people in the camp are getting all the attention and getting all the resources, and they've begun attacking the Darfuris. There's another incident which is very unpleasant, that some of the sheikhs are selling the young men in their own tribes to the rebels. They're selling children to rebel groups. This is not helpful. And then there's a third development, which is that a lot of the women who've been raped are becoming impregnated and giving birth to Janjaweed babies. And those women are being stigmatized, seriously stigmatized. So before you get carried away with respecting all of the cultural traditions, also think about what it's like to be completely thrown out of your society because you're a woman and because this has happened to you. And I would beg you to consider that universal human rights are paramount in this situation.
Hi. First, you said earlier when you began that you're not an expert. However, for what you do and for bringing it here to us, personalizing it so much, I want to thank you. And in that vein of personalizing with the children's photos, with the essays that have been done, or not photos, well, yeah, with the photos, with the artwork, has anybody done or plan on doing actual recorded interviews with the victims and the survivors in the vein of an oral history? Yeah,
we do, but we cannot make them public because that would put the lives of these people at risk. That little boy, Rashid, that's not his name. I can't tell you his name because the Sudanese government would love to kill that little boy. We have to be responsible, and frankly, if that pisses off some academics, I don't care. We've got to protect those people. When this is all over, then, of course, and we're giving these, I should add, we're giving all this to the International Criminal Court in The Hague.
Sorry, it's me again. I just had another follow-up question. Something that STAND encounters when we're trying to speak about issues in Darfur and Burma and whatnot is that the rhetoric talking about asking politicians to intervene is very similar, unfortunately, to George Bush's rhetoric into why we should intervene in Iraq and, bring democracy to them and whatnot.
Yep.
Can you please tell us how we can frame that so that, people could understand what the differentiation, that it's not just, people say, okay, then you got to bring them food. Well, it's not humanitarian. Can you please say what you mean or expand on that a little? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And incidentally, so far I'm really impressed by the questions here. Last week I was in California, and after I'd given that talk, the first question, somebody actually said to me, "Why are their teeth so white?" So, moving on. You're right, and when I said Iraq was the worst possible thing that could happen to Darfur, that's exactly what I mean, because if you talk about intervention, you are immediately called a neocon. You also get tarred, of course, with the Zionist brush, that obviously you're anti-Arab. That's when you have to point out that it's Muslim killing Muslim, that it's incredibly important that you point out that this is governments across Africa who choose not to do something about this because they don't want the spotlight shined on them, but also that actually we're not trying to impose something, a system of government or belief on the people of Darfur. We're simply trying to stop genocide, which I think is a lot different than what your country and my country said they were trying to do in Iraq, although they did keep changing their mind, didn't they? I was too dim to really follow that.
You were talking earlier about the women and what has been going on with the second wave of genocide, being raped, and about how some of these women are taken as slaves and moved. So what is being done specifically for the more vulnerable populations in that area? Because they're all vulnerable, but the first wave the men are killed. So it's the women, it seems like, who have to deal with the,
Yep.
I'm not sure if I'm articulating this right.
No, I
but
get your
they're
point.
the one left behind. So what is being done to help them stay safe, or what could we do? Because you were talking about how the camps themselves are just, they aren't being kept safe. They're just in a very vulnerable position.
Nothing is being done. And it's up to the women to hold the families together, to cope, to try and get the firewood, to feed people, to try and keep their children sane. The burden, as in so many places around the world, is on the women, and the women are being stigmatized, and they're not getting any help at all. A little story, when I came back from my trip to Darfur, for a very brief and bizarre period of time, my articles in a particular magazine used to end up on Tony Blair's pillow. That wasn't because I personally put them there, but a friend of Cherie Blair used to actually put my articles on Tony Blair's pillow. So when he got into bed at night, he'd say, "Oh, not that bloody woman again." And that meant that I got a brief, shining moment of access to the Blair administration on this subject, and I decided to use it to press for armed escorts to escort the women out of the camp to get the firewood. Now, this is not rocket science, is it? That we might use the UN African Union peacekeepers to accompany the women on the daily, very, very dangerous trek out to get the firewood. And amazingly, we got Tony Blair to commit some money. And he also agreed that we would get African female police people to do it. So we had all these police women from places like Ghana and Rwanda who were trained, sensitized, sent there. They accompanied the women out on the firewood patrols, and the incidence of rape and attack fell dramatically. So this was great. I was really, really pleased with this, and then the money ran out, and they're back to being raped again. That's Darfur.
In Western culture, in particular, I suspect, and maybe elsewhere in the world, a great deal of emphasis is placed on the words we use to describe certain kinds of behaviors. And the word genocide, which is only about 60 years old, is used to describe a wide variety of actions and has evolved from its original definition in 1944. How important is the word genocide to solving the problem? If we were to use different words, would we be more successful? Is the word genocide essential to capturing the attention of the world to put a stop to it?
This is a really interesting point, and I found it incredibly frustrating when I first came back from Darfur and we were trying to get action, the semantics involved in this, and people would say, well, you know, it's technically not a genocide. Like, somehow that makes it okay, what's happening there. And what can I say? 90% of the black African villages ethnically cleansed. That looks and smells and feels like a genocide to me. I'll tell you the really bad moment in all of this was in September 2005 when Colin Powell appeared in front of the United Nations and he said, we determine that this is genocide. And people all over the world started cheering until he said, but that doesn't mean we have to do anything about it. And since then, frankly, the term has been completely devalued. It used to mean that there was a moral obligation on the rest of the world to act. And farce upon farce, the United Nations the following year passed a document called the Responsibility to Protect. And all these, I'm not going to use the word, an Anglo-Saxon word, people at the UN patting themselves on the back saying, never again, never going to let Rwanda happen again, congratulating themselves on this document called the Responsibility to Protect, which basically said state sovereignty is no longer paramount, and that if a government is killing its own citizens, then the rest of the world has an obligation to come and do something about it, a universal human right. And while these people were celebrating this, the murder continued in Darfur. It was as if they were in a complete vacuum. And this is, of course, one of the mind-blowing aspects of this. And I do have to ask myself that if they were white and Christian, these victims, would the same thing be happening? Now, I used to think that If they were white, full stop, something would be done about it. And then Bosnia came along. But you see, they were the wrong kind of Muslims, so no one gave a damn about them. It's very depressing. Do you have any comeback on that? You're the expert.
No, I guess I raised the question because, are there any students from Dr. Kissie's class here? Not yet. All right, so Dr. Kissie is teaching a class in genocide. Todd, why don't you be in the back? There's Todd. Sitting in a class in which Dr. Kissie is teaching a class on genocide, and he's trying to work with the students to come to an understanding of the term, how it was formed and how it applies.
Yep.
And so, you know, when you hear the term used to describe all manner of different things, we had a situation in which when we were formulating the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Center, an individual asked whether or not we would consider the abortion of Down syndrome fetuses to be a genocide. Well, it's not for me to decide, because by doing so, I would immediately be giving some definition to what I thought genocide means. And so I didn't know whether when you use that word genocide, you're more likely to rally support, or whether its enormous politicization is more likely to cause people to stop and say, no, 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 we can't use that word, and therefore we're not going to do anything because you're using a word that doesn't apply.
And this is actually rather a perplexing one, isn't it? And I do think we probably overuse that term, and we overuse the term Holocaust as well. I'll tell you the one that really gets me, though, is when Western women use the word rape, and they don't mean rape. They use it far too lightly. I'll tell you something, it takes so much for a Darfuri woman to actually utter those words. She will use every other word. She will say, I was attacked, I was harassed, I was beaten. It is such a big deal for her to say that. And then when you sit and listen to what is done, it isn't just the act of penetration with a stick or a penis. It is also branding these women like slaves and saying to them as it's going on, you are just a slave. I dilute your blood. You are inferior. And so it does tick me off slightly when I'm in the Western context and I meet some girl who got drunk last night and screwed the wrong guy and woke up this morning and thought, ooh, and then says it was rape. No, it's not. Please, please.
I wanted to talk on what the other young lady said and about what's going on in Iraq and what's going on in Darfur. Like, if we try to do something, would it be the same as what they're trying to do in Iraq? The difference is that they're over there killing them. We're over here trying to stop, what's going on in Darfur. So you really can't compare, us trying to help Darfur and, the Bush administration trying to help Iraq, because it's totally different. You send people over there to kill them, in the disguise of diplomacy or whatever it is. But what we're trying to do is we're over here and say, what can we do for you? You're over there. We're not sure. I think that's the difference, and I hope I didn't offend anyone by saying that, but that's just the difference, trying to help Darfur. Don't compare with Iraq. It's two totally different things. They're over there killing them and we're not.
That's a really good point, actually. Thank you for adding that. And you've reminded me, another aspect that differentiates, of course, is that the African Union voted to send a peacekeeping force to Darfur. So it's not like the African Union saying, no, we shouldn't be there. They do believe that there should be intervention.
Hi. Do you think we could revisit the issue of economic sanctions quickly? Because she made a comment in the back and said, I would boycott Chevron if I knew that they were a part of this. And I've actually run into that response from a lot of people before. And I don't know too much about the apartheid in South Africa, but it seemed like economic sanctions had somewhat of a positive impact in that. So do you think it's totally implausible that those have, benefits if it was citizen-initiated? Or because I just don't want to believe that the only thing we can do is right or call. I mean, that's definitely a big part of it, but...
Yep. That's a really good point. Thank you for that. I suppose I see it a bit higher up the food chain. First of all, one of the problems is that you're punishing Chevron for something that happened in 1976. There are now Western oil companies in Sudan doing business with this monstrous regime, and it's much better to actually try and boycott them. The most effective way to do that is through the genocide divestment campaign that's going on, that is part of STAND, I believe. And they try to get, for instance, union pension funds and public employee pension funds to divest from the shares of companies that are actually actively supporting the Sudanese regime. Here's part of the problem, though. The big players in Sudan are China, because of the oil and because of the weapons they sell them. China, incidentally, I mean, absolutely ghastly record right across Africa. We should all be so concerned about what the Chinese are getting away with. But also the French Total Fina Elf is the name of the oil company that the French have, and they have oil interests in Sudan. They're, just as they do in Burma, incidentally, and they're up to the same disgusting game there. There are Russian and Ukrainian weapons companies who are selling to the Sudanese, but the trouble is it's really quite hard to put pressure on Russia because, as you know, the Russians and the Chinese, what they care about most is state sovereignty, so they can get on and be horrible to the people within their own country as well. So I'm really trying to look at the quickest levers, and divestment is one of the best things that we can be doing. There aren't that many direct levers for boycotting things that you as a consumer can do, but I take your point completely, and of course it mattered during apartheid. And it matters right now with Burma as well.
My question is about the African peacekeepers. Where are they providing help, and where are they not? Where's it not working out, and how would more boots on the ground help?
Okay, Darfur is the size of Texas or France. There are 3 paved roads. Get your mind around that for a start. The United Nations and the African Union decided to send 26,000 troops, and so far half that number have turned up. It's been 3 years, and they have only deployed half that number. They decided not to supply them properly because there's no political will. So they don't have enough gas. They don't even have enough water. I interviewed a guy recently who was one of the African Union guys, a guy from Rwanda I know. They gave him 1 yogurt a day to survive on. That's how much political will there is to support the African Union, United Nations mission in Sudan. It's incredibly important that there are more soldiers there. They have a Chapter 7 mandate, which means that they have the power to protect civilians and disarm the combatants. And they have chosen not to use their full powers because, frankly, they're not properly trained. They're scared. They know there's no political will behind them. You know, they're always being killed by the Sudanese and by the rebels. I mean, it's disgusting that we've done this. We've put these people in harm's way without any proper supplies. Out of every 9 trucks, only 4 of them have a battery. How on earth do we expect these people to do this job? We haven't sent enough helicopters. They've got virtually no helicopters. One of the last things Bush did was actually to agree to send some helicopters, and it'll be jolly nice when those arrive. The trouble is, this reminds me so much of both Bosnia and Rwanda, when, again, the United Nations decided to send a peacekeeping force and then decided to have no political will behind it whatsoever. It was just a fig leaf. It's a gesture. It's like, get this off my desk, out of the in tray, into the out tray. Here's my gesture, now shut up. And there's no political will to actually make sure that this works. In a perfect world, I think that we should actually accept the genocide and civil wars happen. And they're going to keep happening, and maybe what we should do is a standing force that is properly trained and equipped and that can move quickly into these situations. Instead of what happens now, I don't know whether you know this, but what happens now with a lot of the peacekeeping forces, they are made up mostly of Bangladeshi and Pakistani soldiers. The governments of Pakistan and Bangladesh get paid $1,000 a month for every soldier they send. So what they do is they drive their trucks into villages in Bangladesh and Pakistan, and they get village boys who've never even worn a pair of shoes, and they send them out to these places. And not surprisingly, they wet their pants at the first sign of any danger because they're not trained. But these governments make a nice profit out of sending these wretched boys there. So it's not a failure of courage on their part. It's our stupidity in not having the will to train these people and to supply them properly and to give them a clear mandate as well.
The Library and Information Science Department here at USF is offering a course in human rights taught by Dr. McCook, who is here today. And it's one of perhaps the only class in human rights in a library school. And I'm interested to see your opinion if you think that could be something that would be of aid over long term. Though I assume the more people that learn about this, the better off we will be.
Oh, yeah. That's my answer. You really need it. All human beings. I used to take the view that every human being alive should be made to go to Auschwitz and to see it for themselves, because we have, apart from the fact that there's a veneer of civilization that some of us have perfected a little better than others, we are a rather dim species, and we don't seem to learn very quickly. And it's important that every generation learns. If any of you incidentally want to come to Rwanda, I do regular tours there, 7 days. We take people to see the genocide sites, to meet orphans and widows who've survived the genocide, to see the projects that we're involved in, where they're now rebuilding their lives. And if you think it's depressing, it's not. It's the most life-enhancing thing you will ever see, to see these people who lost everything, who literally had their kids chopped up in front of them. And yet, they find the strength to adopt orphan children. They don't have any food. They don't have any support or comfort. Every day they get up and they behave with dignity and humanity. And it's an extraordinary thing to witness. And you can also, in Rwanda, there's a place that I always take my visitors where the French, Foreign Legion, were complicit in gathering together 50,000 Tutsis, who they then starved for a week, and then they threw fragmentation grenades into this building, series of buildings. This is the French. We're talking about 1994. And incidentally, the president, Francois Mitterrand, his son, did the arms deal for this, actually sold the Rwandans the hand grenades. Anyway, 50,000 people perish. And then they went in with machetes and finished off everyone else. And they buried the 50,000. But the Rwandans are not stupid people. And so when the Tutsi overwhelmed the Hutu and established a democratic government, they realized that one of the common features is that some clever dick will always come along and start denying that a Holocaust or a genocide happened. So the Rwandans dug up 871 bodies. And they treated them with lime. And you can still see the skin, the expressions on their faces as they were being hacked to death, people holding their babies close, their skulls caved in, the flesh is perfectly preserved. And I think every human being alive should be made to go and look at that. And I've seen this 7 times, because I've taken 7 different groups of people to see this. And until I die, I'm never going to get that smell out of my nose. And all of us should have that metaphorical smell in our nose. So I thank the University of South Florida for any gesture it makes towards educating all of us to be better human beings.